Very good. I expect that during Chris's rebuttal, he will address the very good reasons I gave why many, not all historians, but why many historians and scholars are doubtful of a high level of likelihood of the existence of a historical Jesus. As I said before, the historical Jesus may have existed. Now, notice that during his rebuttal, let's expect him to reply to those serious problems. Chris does admit that there are some internal problems within the New Testament narratives. He agrees with that. There are internal discrepancies, but he points out that there are some internal coherencies. Of course, that would make sense. There are internal coherencies that you could find that you agree upon. But does that have any bearing on whether or not the actual person existed, or is it more likely to have bearing on the beliefs of the founders of the religion itself? You don't need an actual William Tell in order for there to be a myth about the formation of the Swiss Confederacy. There is doubt among historians about whether William Tell existed or not, but it's irrelevant. Some even doubt whether Muhammad existed, that he was a creation, and I'm not an expert on Islam. So to point out that there are internal coherencies within the Jesus story, and I agree there are. And as Chris accurately pointed out, those gospel stories were written later. The original event, if it happened, Jesus probably died around the year 27, 28, because according to Matthew, he had to be born during the reign of King Herod, who died in the year 4 BC. So how many decades later is it that we even have the earliest mentions of Jesus by Paul, and then of course Mark, and then Matthew and Luke were probably really close together. Notice this. If a mistake I used to make as a preacher, and a mistake a lot of modern Christians make, is they take the entire first century and all the documents. Historians don't do this, but I mean a lot of believers take them all flat, as if they were all telling the same story. But if you will put those documents on a time graph, put Paul here around the year 55, let's say, more or less, maybe 60 as Chris says. Put Mark somewhere around 70, and sure, the dates are rubbery, but the ordering of them is not. You can shift maybe the shape of the curve, but you're going to have basically the same ordering. Matthew maybe around 80, Luke around 85, and then John around 90, 95, maybe even as late as 100. There is variation, I agree with that, but the ordering of it is going to stay the same. What you will notice in the resurrection stories is that the very earliest teaching, the teaching that Paul gave us, which was at least 25 years later, by the way, written to a group of people who were at least 1,500 miles away in Corinth by land, who would have had no way to verify this story about the 500 or so on. We find that Paul did not talk about a bodily resurrection. He used the word egiro rather than anastasis. He did not talk about physical appearances either. He talked about ophthi, that word to appear, is a visionary thing that happened. And he confirms it by saying he appeared also to me, using that word. And of course, he did not have a bodily appearance by Jesus. He had a spiritual appearance. In Paul's writings, we have a very simple story with not many extraordinary events in it. Kind of simple, basic, straight. Although it does start with a poetic, kind of formulaic, in 1 Corinthians 15 idea, which leans more toward legend than history. But then when you get to Mark, we find one young man in the tomb, dressed in white. That might have been an angel, so maybe there's an extraordinary event showing up. We move later in history to Matthew, we're going to have more angels. We're going to have earthquakes and zombies crawling out of the graves and appearing themselves, everybody, and what, getting remarried or going back to their jobs, what? We start finding more extraordinary events happening. You get to Luke, you even have a greater number of extraordinary events. And when you get to John, wow, you have somebody actually touching the physical body of Jesus. You have somebody materializing through a solid door, and you have all this, the mistake I used to make was to view the first century through the lens of John backwards, when actually what's happening is there's a growth. There's a growth pattern of an exaggeration of a myth that may have started with the simple belief there may have been a historical Jesus, and you can't prove there wasn't, and I'm not claiming that you can prove there wasn't a historical Jesus. But in any event, the early believers, like Peter, might have thought that when he died and disappointed them because he didn't come back again, that he ascended to heaven spiritually, much like we would say Grandma went to heaven, right? Grandma died and went to heaven. Jesus died, went to heaven. Caesar Augustus died, went to heaven. They used those words to raise. And yet then he spoke and prayed to Jesus, and he said, Jesus is still alive. So maybe the early people before Paul had this belief that their Messiah had risen bodily from the dead. But later generations came along, second, third, fourth generations of Christians came along and perverted that early teaching. And you can see that perversion as history progresses until you get to an extraordinary thing. And you know what that is? That's the footprints of legend. It's much more likely that Jesus was not Lord, liar, or lunatic, but simply the result of a legendary process.